I'd like to invite the speakers to come up and field some questions. We have actually a fairly short time for questions, but those of you who wish to further explore some of the themes of our speakers, I invite you to go to the microphone in the back. We'll do this for about 10, 15 minutes at the most, and then we'll hear some closing remarks from Paul Chott-Smith. I'm looking for that line in front of the microphone. I'm looking. So I'll get started. So why don't we see if we can chew on this for a little bit. The title of the exhibition here at the Detroit, at the National Museum of the American Indian for this celebration is Kay WalkingStick, an American Artist. And that clearly, that's a strategy that the National Museum of the American Indian has invoked to try to, and in some ways, sort of address some of the issues that all four of our speakers have brought up in terms of how we position this whole notion of indigeneity, of Cherokee ancestry, of minority work within, minorities working within this larger field that's often, suffered from this kind of hegemony of white male privilege. I guess what I would invite the speakers to kind of reflect on is, particularly in the context of the National Museum of the American Indian, where our visitors may be looking for other kinds of Indians than we're presenting perhaps with this exhibition. What are the sort of strengths and pitfalls of this strategy for us? Trying to position Kay WalkingStick as an American artist. Jolene has already kind of offered this notion of the priority of the indigenous American artist as a sort of a starting point. But I just appreciate your thinking about that as you reflect on it. Thank you.
Well, this morning at breakfast, we were talking about the fact that when the museum opened, the art critics from the New York Times and from the Washington Post were very unkind about many things. And one of the very odd things that they had to say was, well, there's this show of George Morrison and Alan Hauser that, why is it there? It could be in any art museum in the country, which really speaks to what you just said, that that's not what they were expecting to find. And yet it's the job of the museum to show them not just what they're expecting to find, but, ranges and ranges of diversity, both historical and contemporary. So in that way, I think it's a sort of nice curve back around to what you thought of as a very important way to open the museum, to say not only do we have these community voices and so forth, but we have these artists that have been grappling with art world issues that are universal.
I was recently in conversation with one of the curators at the Whitney. And one of the things that always occurs to me when somebody calls something American is that we need a definition of American. The Whitney Museum of American Art has American in its title, and as a museum has done a great deal of interrogation of what American might be, and has decided that anybody who did some work in the United States at some point in their career is within their purview. I would say, not being a museum person, when I think of what makes something American from my academic standpoint, I always teach it as a question, not something that actually has an answer. I think of America as a settler colony with a history of slavery and a dedication theoretically from its moment to a Republican form of governance. How do these things work together or contradict one another? That's what's American, is that this is the context and set of problems that we're grappling with, and certainly we continue to grapple with them, and that's a perfectly appropriate context to look at someone like Kay's work in. But I'm not sure designating something American or not is something that can be accomplished. It can be questioned and proposed, but it's hard to say that calling something American stands for anything other than asking a certain set of questions about it.
And I would extend that observation to, not only is in America a settler colony predicated on slavery, but also genocide.
Yes.
And so I think that until the playing field of power and equity is leveled, I think it's very risky for Indigenous people to sign on for a seamless inclusion without really problematizing what this means. Because if we don't have our land bases, in order for us to reproduce any of the knowledge that we value as Indigenous, which much of that is predicated on land, and I'm not suggesting this notion of discrete reservation territories, but I'm saying that if we don't have access to land in a more profound way, I think it really does compromise our continuance. And so, you know, there's all kinds of ways that we can cut this and slice it, but I do think it's a risky framing for us to sign on for.
Does anyone add anything?
Sorry?
Okay.
You know, you
Well,
wrote the
no, I'm
textbook,
sorry.
you must know what American is.
I don't, it's a terribly fraught question. I'm sitting here thinking, how am I going to address this? I do agree with Jolene, and I also agree with what you have said, that, I mean, it's very complicated. You want, in a sense, ideally, you want both. You want an acknowledgement of Native identity and history and culture, but you also want inclusiveness. And I think it's the challenge of sort of balancing those two claims that's so difficult, because inclusiveness often involves a certain forgetting as well. So.
And I might add that, you know, this idea that, you know, rolled into this is this idea of nation or nationalism at precisely a moment when national borders are much more permeable on one hand, but then think about what's happening in Europe. The borders, you know, they're actually thinking about building fences. And so this idea of a discrete space, I think, is really complicated by commerce, and so, or by the way in which trade moves in the world. And so, you know, where do Indigenous peoples fit in this, I think, is a question that, in my opinion, could be more central and could be worked out through a space like this, that it needs to be slightly more critical. And not suggesting that it's not, but it could be taken up a little more. But, you know, I understand, like, and I think that this moment of defunding in the arts, you know, the Piss Christ moment, was all about, maybe it was too critical. You know, maybe this happened. And so I understand the dance we all dance in order to both move forward a little, pull back, move forward, pull back. And so I think that, you know, we're happy for the space, but at the same time, you know, we want the territory. Do you have any more questions, David?
That was a good one. I thought that was a good one. Well, you know, when actually Kay and I were talking about the symposium, one of the things that she wondered if we might focus on is this whole issue of landscape and her being, and certainly the turn in her work over the past decade or so has been more, you know, she now almost characterizes herself as a landscape painter, of course, and there's more to it than that. But clearly the recent landscapes, and you see them in the last part of the gallery, are these large monumental Western landscapes that, for my eye, very much engage this tradition of kind of heroic landscape painting in the American art canon. So I wonder if I could invite maybe any of you to reflect a little bit on this, on those paintings in particular. I think in most of your remarks you've chosen to focus on some earlier work. The Italian, I think, work certainly provokes a lot of thought, a lot of questions. What issues are raised in your mind from maybe this focus on landscape in these more recent years?
I mean, I'll start, since I wrote a book on landscape. That doesn't authorize me. But I mean, I think that it did occur to me as I was looking at the work that, you know, Kay's point of view is very, it's in the landscape. There's a sense of kind of immersiveness and being down in the landscape rather than standing above it and objectifying it. And all of the themes that we've heard about today, I think, really amplify on that sense of a kind of continuum between the human and the natural, a continuum between body and land and nature. But one that is done from a point of view that is distance from the stereotyping, these dangerous stereotypes that always are lurking in the background. And I think part of the way she does that Kay does that is through the surface, the medium. The medium is so sensuous. The color, the palettes are often so beautiful. The specific thematics, the erotics of the body and nature. So all of those, I think, undercut this tradition of mastery, of male, gendered mastery over the landscape that has come to define, for better or worse, the tradition of American landscape painting. Not uniquely, and I don't want to boil it down to that by any means, because it's a very complex history, but at least in terms of the classic phase that I think you're alluding to, David, there is a certain assumption of mastery and visual kind of sovereignty.
I'd want to add to this conversation from two perspectives. The first is, the thing that really blew me away when I went upstairs was the scale of the work. And I don't think that comes across in reproduction, and it doesn't even come across when you see a single piece of Kay's, which is how I've mostly encountered them in the past. This is very ambitious in its scale, and I think the monumentality of it really drives home a comparison, particularly with a maybe second generation or a late 19th century landscape tradition, which is also a particularly visible tradition here in Washington, D.C. So to see that and to know that there's a Moran not too far away definitely makes that comparison really work in a way that I think is really meaningful, because then, again, as I've said, I think the dialogue that Kay's work has with other pieces enhances one's experience of both her work and the other pieces. The other thing that I would like to say, though, and this is sort of vis-a-vis the permeous borders point that Jolene just made, is it is obviously clear to me that settler colonies, particularly Anglo-settler colonies, reified landscape as their national artistic traditions fairly early on, endorsing them in the 19th century, whether it's Australia or the United States, and to a certain extent Latin American countries too, decided that landscape was their national idioms for settler colonial purposes, right, to sort of appropriate that land. But landscape is a global tradition. Landscape is absolutely a global tradition, and to say it is the American tradition is to deny the significance of landscape in China, and to think that somehow we have a particular kind of landscape, and yet it's a very, very important tradition elsewhere. And right now there's this circulating exhibition put together by the Terra Foundation of landscapes of the Americas that even just, although these are all settler colonies, at least begins to sort of remove the association in some people's minds of landscape with the United States specifically, and see it more as an artistic tradition available in multiple contexts, able to be applied to multiple political agendas, and having some kinds of tendencies and some kind of political formations to support national myth-making. But I don't want to reify that myth-making as the only thing landscape can do, or even necessarily the appropriate thing for us to think of when we think of landscape.
Would you please?
Never. Never.
First, I want to say thank you to the 4 panelists here and the 4 panelists that spoke earlier. You were all terrific, just terrific, just terrific. I also want to say that I really appreciate David bringing up this issue of landscape, because what you've been talking about is my past. Mm-hmm. And my past probably has a little interest, but what I'm interested in is the present. And the present for me is about making paintings for me. just for me and my dear husband. We travel together, Dirk and I. Dirk Bach is also an artist, by the way. You should look him up. And we travel together, and he very graciously drives along saying, how about that one, Kay? Do you want to draw that one? Or how about this river? This is a nice river. We have a lovely time looking at landscape, and the landscape that I paint is everywhere in these United States. And it is about the beauty of the land, the seductiveness of the land. There's something very elemental, very close to my heart in this wonderful American landscape. And I want to depict it as our land, all of our land, but it's native land. It's all indigenous land. And so I'm painting it for myself because I love to paint it. I love to travel with my dear husband, and I love to look at it. But I'm painting it for everyone to remind us of this exquisite land and all the political levels of it. I admit, I'm sure you're right. But, I mean, you know, what do I know? but the truth is, it's about seeing. It's about seeing this beautiful place we call our planet. So it's a celebration of that. And I celebrate it for all of us. I want to thank these people who have worked so hard on these wonderful talks. It kind of is mind-blowing, I have to tell you, for me to listen to it. And I also want to thank my husband, who is such a wonderful supporter of my views about painting. Well, not always, but but I want to thank him for being the person that he is. And I thank you all for being here. Enjoy this show. And remember that it's about the pleasure of seeing. Thank you very much. Woo!